The style of writing seen in this passage is common in English literature of the 19th century. It reflects the characteristics of the realistic and social novel, which gained popularity during that time. Authors like Jane Austen, whose work, Pride and Prejudice, were known for their realistic portrayal of social interactions, manners, and the concerns of the upper and middle classes. The dialogue-driven narrative, attention to social conventions and relationships, and the exploration of themes such as marriage and social status are typical of the 19th-century English novel. We strive to make the story of Pride and Prejudice more accessible to readers by using a simple and easily understandable style of writing. By doing so, we aim to remove the potential barrier of unfamiliar 19th-century English language and allow readers to fully engage with the story itself. To achieve this, we start by simplifying the language and sentence structures. Instead of using complex or archaic phrases, we opt for straightforward and modern expressions and focus on clarity and brevity, avoiding overly long sentences or convoluted descriptions. By using concise and clear language, we can ensure that readers can easily follow the narrative and understand the events and emotions depicted in the story. Additionally, we provide explanations or clarifications for any historical or cultural references that may be unfamiliar to contemporary readers. This could involve briefly describing social customs, etiquette, or societal norms that are relevant to the plot. By providing this context, readers can better understand the motivations and actions of the characters, enhancing their overall reading experience. Another aspect to consider is to maintain the use of dialogue in the original novel. While retaining the essence of the characters' personalities and interactions, we can adapt the language used in conversations to be more accessible. This means avoiding excessive formality or archaic expressions and focusing on natural and relatable dialogue. By doing so, readers can easily grasp the dynamics between characters and the emotions conveyed through their conversations.
Overall, our approach aims to make Pride and Prejudice more approachable and enjoyable for readers by simplifying the language, providing necessary context, and ensuring that the focus remains on the captivating story and its themes. By presenting the novel in a more accessible style, we create an opportunity for a wider range of readers to appreciate and connect with the timeless tale crafted by Jane Austen.
It is a truth universally acknowledged, that a single man in possession of a good fortune, must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families, that he is considered as the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters. "My dear Mr. Bennet," said his lady to him one day, "have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last?" Mr. Bennet replied that he had not. "But it is," returned she, "for Mrs. Long has just been here, and she told me all about it."
Mrs. Long is a friend of Mrs. Bennet, and her disclosure about Mr. Bingley's occupancy of Netherfield Park play a significant role in sparking Mrs. Bennet's interest in him as a potential suitor for one of her daughters.
Mr. Bennet made no answer. "Do not you want to know who has taken it?" cried his wife impatiently. "You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it." This was invitation enough. "Why, my dear, you must know. Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and four to see the place, and was so much delighted with it that he agreed with Mr. Morris immediately, that he is to take possession before Michaelmas, and some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of next week."
Mr. Morris is likely a representative or agent involved in the agreement or transaction regarding the rental or purchase of the property. Michaelmas is a traditional Christian feast day and it is observed on September 29, near the beginning of autumn. In England, it was a notable tradition to have a meal consisting of goose on Michaelmas. This custom was believed to have originated from the anecdote that Queen Elizabeth I was enjoying a meal of goose when she received the news of the Armada's defeat.
What is his name? Bingley. Is he married or single? Oh, single, my dear, to be sure. A single man of large fortune, 4 or 5,000 a year. What a fine thing for our girls. How so? How can it affect them? My dear Mr. Bennet, replied his wife, how can you be so tiresome? You must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them. Is that his design in settling here? Design. Nonsense, how can you talk so? But it is very likely that he may fall in love with one of them, and therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes. I see no occasion for that. You and the girls may go, or you may send them by themselves, which perhaps will be still better, for as you are as handsome as any of them, Mr. Bingley might like you the best of the party. My dear, you flatter me. I certainly have had my share of beauty, but I do not pretend to be anything extraordinary now. When a woman has 5 grown-up daughters, she ought to give over thinking of her own beauty. In such cases, a woman has not often much beauty to think of.
In this passage from Pride and Prejudice, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet are discussing the arrival of a young man named Mr. Bingley in their neighbourhood. Mrs. Bennet is excited about the prospect of Mr. Bingley's arrival because he is a single man with a large fortune, making him a potentially desirable match for one of their 5 daughters. When Mr. Bennet asks how Mr. Bingley's presence could affect their daughters, Mrs. Bennet explains that she hopes one of their daughters will marry him. He questions whether this is Mr. Bingley's intention in settling in their neighbourhood, but she dismisses the idea, believing it is likely that Mr. Bingley may fall in love with one of their daughters. Mr. Bennet sees no need for them to visit Mr. Bingley immediately and suggests that she and the girls can go or even send the girls by themselves. He teases her, saying that Mr. Bingley might actually prefer her over their daughters because she is just as attractive as they are. Mrs. Bennet modestly downplays her own beauty, stating that as a woman with 5 grown-up daughters, she shouldn't dwell on her own appearance. This banter between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet showcases their contrasting personalities, with Mr. Bennet often employing sarcastic humor and Mrs. Bennet displaying her eagerness to secure advantageous matches for their daughters.
But, my dear, you must indeed go and see Mr. Bingley when he comes into the neighbourhood. It is more than I engage for, I assure you. But consider your daughters. Only think what an establishment it would be for one of them. Sir William and Lady Lucas are determined to go, merely on that account, for in general you know they visit no newcomers. Indeed you must go, for it will be impossible for us to visit him, if you do not. You are over-scrupulous surely. I dare say Mr. Bingley will be very glad to see you, and I will send a few lines by you to assure him of my hearty consent to his marrying whichever he chooses of the girls, though I must throw in a good word for my little Lizzie. I desire you will do no such thing. Lizzie is not a bit better than the others, and I am sure she is not half so handsome as Jane, nor half so good-humoured as Lydia. But you are always giving her the preference. They have none of them much to recommend them, replied he. They are all silly and ignorant like other girls, but Lizzie has something more of quickness than her sisters.
In this part of the conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet urges him to go and see Mr. Bingley when he arrives in the neighbourhood. He, however, is reluctant and replies that he cannot commit to doing so. Mrs. Bennet emphasizes the importance of considering their daughters and the potential benefits that could arise from a connection with Mr. Bingley. She mentions that even Sir William and Lady Lucas, who typically do not visit newcomers, have decided to go because of the opportunities it presents for their daughters. Mrs. Bennet insists that Mr. Bennet must go, as it would be impossible for them to visit Mr. Bingley if he does not make the first move. Mr. Bennet believes that Mr. Bingley would be happy to see her wife and suggests that he could send a letter to convey his consent for Mr. Bingley to marry whichever of their daughters he chooses. He also mentions that he wants to speak favourably of their daughter Elizabeth, whom he fondly calls Lizzie. However, Mrs. Bennet disagrees with Mr. Bennet's preference for Elizabeth and argues that she is not superior to their other daughters. She claims that Elizabeth is not as beautiful as Jane, their eldest daughter, nor as good-natured as Lydia, their youngest daughter. Mr. Bennet admits that all of their daughters may have their shortcomings and are like other young girls in terms of their silliness and ignorance, but he believes that Elizabeth possesses more quickness of mind compared to her sisters. This passage highlights the contrasting opinions of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet regarding their daughters and their potential matches. Mrs. Bennet is eager to secure a favorable marriage for her daughters, while Mr. Bennet takes a more skeptical and sarcastic stance, pointing out the flaws and similarities among their girls.
Mr. Bennet, how can you abuse your own children in such a way? You take delight in vexing me. You have no compassion on my poor nerves. You mistake me, my dear. I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. I have heard you mention them with consideration these 20 years at least. Ah, you do not know what I suffer. But I hope you will get over it, and live to see many young men of 4,000 a year come into the neighborhood. It will be no use to us, if 20 such should come, since you will not visit them. Depend upon it, my dear, that when there are 20, I will visit them all. Mr. Bennet was so odd a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humor, reserve, and caprice, that the experience of 23 years had been insufficient to make his wife understand his character. Her mind was less difficult to develop. She was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous. The business of her life was to get her daughters married, its solace was visiting and news.
In this part of the passage, Mrs. Bennet expresses her frustration with Mr. Bennet's behavior towards their children. She accuses him of abusing their own children and taking pleasure in vexing her. She is expressing her frustration and complaint, accusing him of not considering or sympathizing with her feelings and emotional well-being. Mr. Bennet, however, responds in a sarcastic manner, assuring his wife that he actually has a great respect for her nerves. He humorously suggests that he has been hearing about her nerves for at least 20 years, implying that it has become a long-standing topic of discussion between them. Mrs. Bennet insists that Mr. Bennet doesn't understand her suffering, to which he replies that he hopes she will eventually overcome her troubles and live to see many wealthy young men come into the neighborhood. He implies that the arrival of eligible suitors with significant fortunes would alleviate her concerns. Mrs. Bennet, still dissatisfied, remarks that it would be of no use if such young men were to come since Mr. Bennet refuses to visit them. However, Mr. Bennet reassures her that if there were indeed 20 such men, he would visit all of them, emphasizing his sarcastic nature. The passage concludes by describing Mr. Bennet's character as an unusual blend of quick intelligence, sarcastic humor, reserved behavior, and unpredictable whims. Despite being married for 23 years, his wife still struggles to fully understand his personality. In contrast, Mrs. Bennet is portrayed as a woman of limited understanding, lacking in knowledge and having an unpredictable temperament. Her main focus in life is to find suitable husbands for her daughters, and she finds solace in social visits and hearing the latest news.